I felt Denise's hand close around my arm before I heard her voice. "You okay?" she whispered, close enough that her breath moved the loose strand of hair by my ear. "You've got that look." I smiled the way I'd been smiling at her for over a year now. Warm, grateful, steady. The smile of a woman who has finally found solid ground after months of not knowing which parts of her life were real. "I'm fine," I said. "Better than fine, actually." She had no way of knowing what that sentence actually meant. She thought it meant I had finally healed, that after everything, after all the nights she'd shown up at my door with wine and a list of reasons my husband didn't deserve me, I had reached the other side of my own suspicion and come out whole. She believed, completely, that I trusted her more than I trusted anyone else alive. She was wrong about all of it, and she had 4 minutes left to find that out. Across the reception hall, Marcus was laughing at something his cousin had said, one hand loose around a glass of champagne he wasn't going to finish. 22 years of marriage teaches you to read a man's hands. His were calm tonight. He thought this was just his niece's wedding. He had no idea it was the night everything he'd spent 3 years hiding was going to come apart in front of 40 people who loved him. Denise squeezed my arm again. "I'm proud of you," she said. "The way you've handled all of this. I don't know many women who could have done it with this much grace." I looked at her, really looked, the way I'd trained myself to look at people over the last year, cataloging the small things I used to let pass without a second thought. The emerald dress, the same shade she'd worn the night, months ago, that she'd first said another woman's name out loud like it had only just occurred to her. The bracelet on her wrist, the one she'd told our whole family Marcus had picked out for her birthday. The way her eyes kept drifting past my shoulder every few seconds, tracking the room, tracking him, in a rhythm she almost certainly didn't know she was still doing. "You've been such a good friend to me," I said. It was true. It was also the most carefully built sentence I had spoken in a year, because it meant two entirely different things depending on who understood it, and only one person in that conversation knew both meanings. I had a folder in my car, nothing dramatic, the kind of plain manila folder I'd use for a client's paint samples. Inside it were 4 documents Denise didn't know I had, a timeline that only made sense once you knew where to look, and one detail that Marcus had never told anyone at all, not even the woman he'd been lying to his own wife about, on and off, for nearly 3 years. The band started a new song. Behind me, my niece's laugh rang out over the crowd, bright and unbothered, the laugh of a girl who still believed every marriage in her family was exactly what it looked like from the outside. Denise leaned in one more time. "You know I've got your back, right? No matter what happens with him. I mean that." "I know you do," I said, and for the first time in a year, I let just a sliver of what I actually felt slide into my voice. Not enough for her to catch it in the moment. Enough that when she replayed this exact exchange later, and she would replay it for months, she would understand that I had already known. I just hadn't decided yet whether tonight was the night I let her find that out. It was. 3 years before that wedding, I could not have imagined standing in a reception hall preparing to end my marriage in front of my husband's entire family. I was 44 then, and my life had the specific, hard-won order of a woman who had built everything herself. My design studio, Renard Interiors, had just been profiled in a regional magazine as one of the 10 firms to watch in the Southeast. My marriage was 21 years old, and, as far as I knew, solid in the unremarkable way long marriages are solid. Not thrilling, not perfect, but load-bearing. I should tell you what Marcus was like before any of this, because it matters for understanding why none of it seemed possible at first. He was not a cold man. He remembered the names of my clients' kids. He called his mother every Sunday without being asked. He'd cried, openly, at both our daughters' college graduations, embarrassed about it afterward in a way that only made me love him more. People liked Marcus easily, the way you like a house with good light. I had built 2 decades of trust on that foundation, and I think it's worth saying plainly, because a story about betrayal only means something if it admits the man doing the betraying was, for a very long time, genuinely good to be around. The first thing that changed was so small I nearly laughed at myself for noticing it. Marcus had always left his phone face up on the kitchen island, screen unlocked half the time, because he'd never had a reason to hide anything from me. One Tuesday that March, I came downstairs and the phone was gone. I found it later in his jacket pocket in the hall closet, screen dark. That was all. A phone moved from a counter to a pocket. I told myself it meant nothing. People misplace habits the way they misplace keys. Then it became a pattern. The phone stopped living on the island permanently. It went into his pocket, his gym bag, the console of his car. He started taking it into the bathroom, which he had never once done in 21 years, not even when our daughter was a newborn and he was too exhausted to keep his eyes open. I let a lot of things go that spring, because letting things go had always been part of how I loved him. Marcus wasn't a man who responded well to being questioned. He'd grown up in a house where his mother tracked his father's every move, and he'd told me once, early on, that he never wanted a wife who made him feel like a suspect in his own life. I'd taken that seriously, maybe too seriously. By May, the late evenings had a different texture. He'd always worked late during a big deal. That was normal. That was Marcus. This was a man coming home at 9:40 instead of 9, showering immediately. When the old Marcus came home at 9, exhausted, and collapsed straight onto the couch. This was a man with a gym bag permanently in his trunk that he swore he used 3 times a week, though I never once saw him leave for the gym or come home sweaty. I didn't confront him. I watched. That's the thing people don't understand about a woman like me. I didn't build a design firm by reacting to every problem the moment I noticed it. I built it by sitting with information until I understood what it actually meant. So I sat with the phone habits and the long evenings, and I let him believe nothing had changed, while I quietly started paying attention to the calendar he thought I never looked at. I think about that spring sometimes when I picture where I ended up standing, 2 years later, in a rented carriage house with a folder in my car. At that wedding, Denise would lean against the bar in her emerald dress, watching the dance floor with the specific pride of a woman who'd planned every detail of the evening herself, and she would have no idea that the woman beside her had spent 2 years learning to watch the way she watched. None of it felt like the beginning of anything back in that first spring. It just felt like a Tuesday, and then another Tuesday, and then a woman deciding to keep her eyes open a little longer than usual. It was Denise who noticed something was wrong with me before I said a word to anyone. We'd always been close, in the specific way in-laws sometimes are when the family dynamics line up right. Denise was 3 years older than Marcus, sharp-tongued, funny in the way that could take the air out of a room, divorced from a man named Curtis who had, by her account, spent 8 years making her feel small. She ran her own event planning company, Whitfield & Co., which had built a real reputation among Atlanta's wealthier families for weddings and galas that looked effortless and cost a fortune. We'd bonded years earlier over both being women who'd built something with their own hands in industries that liked to underestimate women who looked like us. She called on a Sunday that June, ostensibly to talk seating charts for my daughter's engagement party. Somewhere in the middle of it, she stopped. "You're not really here," she said. "Where'd you go?" "I'm here. Camille, I've known you 12 years. You get quiet in a specific way when something's wrong, and you've had that voice for weeks." I didn't tell her everything that day, just the phone, because it was smallest and easiest to say without it sounding like an accusation. Denise was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me something I would remember for the rest of my life, though not for the reason I expected to remember it. "I hope I'm wrong," she said, "but I want you to hear this from someone who loves you before you hear it from anyone else. My father did the exact same thing to my mother, the phone thing. It was always the phone thing first." She told me a story that afternoon I'd never heard in 12 years of knowing her, about her father, about the years her mother spent making excuses for him, about the quiet grief of loving a man slowly rearranging his life around someone he hadn't told you about yet. She cried a little. I remember thinking, this is a woman who's been carrying this a long time, and she's trusting me with it because she's scared for me. I'm not saying Marcus is doing what my father did, she said. I don't want to put that on you. But if something's wrong, I don't want you finding out alone. I did that. I watched my mother find out alone, and it broke something in her that never fully came back. That was the day Denise became the person I trusted most in my own marriage. Over the following weeks, she called more. She showed up at my studio with lunch, unannounced, the way she said she wished someone had done for her mother. She told me I was allowed to ask questions. She told me I wasn't imagining things. She told me, more than once, that I deserved a man who didn't make me doubt my own eyes. Denise made me laugh that whole summer, even in the middle of everything, which I think is the part of this story people find hardest to reconcile once they know how it ends. She had a merciless sense of humor about her own divorce. She used to say Curtis had the emotional range of a parking meter, and she'd do this specific, cutting impression of him checking his watch mid-conversation that made me laugh so hard I cried at least twice that year. Real laughing, the kind that has nothing to do with performance. She showed up unannounced one Thursday with a bag of takeout and a face mask kit and made me sit through an entire spa night I hadn't asked for and desperately needed, painting my toes a ridiculous shade of orange because, she said, sad women should not be allowed to pick their own colors. She remembered which of my clients were difficult and asked about them by name months later. She once drove 40 minutes at 11 at night because I'd called her crying and hung up too fast, just to sit on my porch with me until I calmed down, not saying much of anything, just being there. I want to be honest about all of that because if I only tell you the parts of Denise that turned out to be lies, I'd be lying to you too. Most of what she gave me that year was real. That's what made the rest of it unforgivable. By July, the phone thing had turned into something else. A hotel charge showed up on a joint credit card statement, a Marriott in Buckhead, 90 minutes from our house, a single night on a Tuesday when Marcus told me he'd stayed late at the office for a closing. When I asked, he said it was a client dinner that ran too late to drive home safely, and he hadn't wanted to wake me. Smooth. Maybe too smooth, but I couldn't prove a smooth answer was a lie. I told Denise before I told my own sister. A Marriott in Buckhead, she repeated, and something crossed her face I read at the time as anger on my behalf. That's not far from his office at all. That's not a too-tired-to-drive hotel. That's a specific hotel. You know it? I've booked event blocks there. It's nice, private, good service, the kind of place people go when they don't want to run into anyone they know. She caught herself half a beat too late. For events, I mean, clients. I didn't think anything of the correction. It read like a woman being careful with her words because she loved both of us and didn't want to burn down a family over a hunch. I wouldn't understand that sentence differently for a long time. Do you want me to look into it? She asked. I know people at that hotel. I could find out who was in a room that night without anyone knowing I asked. I said yes. I want to be honest about something because it matters for everything that follows. At the time, letting Denise take that step felt like the safest, smartest thing I could do. I had a business to run. I didn't want to hire a stranger and turn my life into something official and permanent before I knew what I was dealing with. Denise offered a door that felt softer than that. Ask a favor, get an answer, decide what to do next. It would be a long time before I understood that the softness of that door was the entire design. By August, Denise had a name. I'm not 100%, she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, voice low even though we were alone. But the front desk manager I know said there was a woman in that room, younger, professional-looking, didn't get a name, but Marcus signed for 2. That doesn't tell us who she is. She hesitated in a way that looked, at the time, like reluctance to wound me. I've been thinking about it. I don't want to say this if I'm wrong, because it's a big thing to say about someone, but has it crossed your mind? Priscilla? The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Priscilla Combs was Marcus's business partner. Polished, ambitious, 34. The kind of woman with the specific energy of someone who intended to run her own firm within the decade. I'd never once suspected her. But the moment Denise said it, a half-dozen memories rearranged themselves. The way she and Marcus stood close at the firm's holiday party, laughing at something no one else heard. The way she'd texted him twice during our anniversary dinner and he'd stepped outside for the second call, a spring deal that had required an unusual number of late nights for two people who, as far as I knew, weren't that close. Why her, specifically? I don't know for sure, Denise said. It's just, I saw them together at the spring gala, and there was something about the way she looked at him. I didn't think anything of it then. I can't stop thinking about it now. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Marcus, listening to him breathe, running Priscilla Combs through every memory I had of the last 2 years. By morning, I had built a case against her, thorough enough to argue in court. I did see the two of them together that fall, at the firm's annual client gala, and I want to describe it honestly because it's the closest thing I had to first-hand evidence of anything. They stood near the bar for maybe 10 minutes, heads tilted toward each other over the noise, and at one point she laughed and touched his forearm, briefly, the way colleagues sometimes do. Denise, beside me, went very still. "Look at that," she murmured. "Look how comfortable she is touching him." Something hot and humiliating rose in my chest, watching my husband laugh with an ease he hadn't shown me over dinner in months. What I didn't notice, because I wasn't looking for it yet, was Denise's own hand on Marcus's back 20 minutes later, steering him toward a photo with a major client, a touch so practiced and unremarkable that no one in that ballroom registered it as anything but a sister managing her brother through a work event. I would think about that gala for over a year before I understood that I'd spent the whole night cataloging one woman's hand on my husband's arm while a second woman's hands were on him constantly, all night, in ways so familiar they'd become invisible. There's a version of that August I've never told anyone, not even my own daughter. I sat in my car outside Priscilla's office building for 40 minutes one evening, watching the entrance, waiting to see if she left with Marcus, or after him, or looking rushed the way a woman looks when she's been caught somewhere she shouldn't be. She left alone at 6:15, carrying a gym bag and a laptop case, got into her own car, and drove off without once glancing around the way a woman having an affair with her business partner might. I noted the absence of guilt in her posture, and then talked myself out of what it might mean, because by then, I needed Priscilla to be the answer more than I needed the truth to be accurate. Grief does strange arithmetic. It takes an absence of evidence and quietly converts it into evidence of something else if that's the story it needs to keep functioning. I mentioned the stakeout to Denise the next day, half embarrassed. Instead of telling me I was being paranoid, she leaned forward, genuinely interested, and asked exactly what time Priscilla had left, exactly what she'd been carrying, which direction she'd driven. I answered all of it, flattered someone was finally taking my instincts seriously. It didn't occur to me until much later that I had just handed a woman managing my entire investigation a precise report of my own surveillance habits. What I watched for, how long I'd wait, what I noticed, and what I missed. She wasn't just directing my suspicion, she was studying it. By October, I had what felt like a mountain of circumstantial evidence, all of it pointing at Priscilla, and Denise had convinced me the kindest, most controlled way to handle it was to confront Priscilla directly, alone, without Marcus knowing, so I could see her reaction with my own eyes. "You'll know," Denise said. "The second you say her name to her face, you'll know if it's true. Women can't hide that from another woman." I've turned that sentence over so many times since. At the time, it felt like sisterhood, one woman promising another that intuition would cut through any lie. Looking back, I think it was closer to a magician directing your eyes to her left hand. Denise knew exactly what a genuinely blindsided face looked like, because she had presumably imagined, more than once, what her own face would need to do the day I finally said the right name to her. She wasn't teaching me to read guilt. She was teaching me what innocence should look like, so that later, when she needed to perform it herself, I'd already believe I knew how to recognize the real thing. There was a quieter push that same week I almost forgot to mention. I'd floated the idea of talking to Renata, a friend in HR at Marcus's firm, about Priscilla's schedule. Denise talked me out of it in a single phone call. Renata talks Camille, everyone knows that, tell her anything, and it's all over the building by Monday. And steered me back toward a private, unwitnessed confrontation instead. I didn't think much of it then. I think about it constantly now. Every path that might have introduced a second set of eyes into my investigation got quietly closed, one reasonable-sounding objection at a time, until the only eyes still watching were hers. I confronted Priscilla on a Thursday afternoon in the parking garage beneath Marcus's office building, having waited nearly 2 hours until I saw her walk to her car alone. I still remember the exact look on her face when I said Marcus's name and the word affair in the same sentence. It was not the look of a guilty woman caught. It was the look of a woman genuinely blindsided, her professional composure cracking into something closer to fear. Camille, I don't know what you think is happening, but there is nothing. The Marriott in Buckhead, April 14th. Her face changed again, and this time it wasn't fear. It was confusion. Real confusion. The kind you cannot fake well enough to fool a woman who has spent 2 decades reading rooms for a living. I wasn't in Buckhead in April, she said slowly. I was in Charleston the second week of April, closing the Fenwick deal. I have receipts, a hotel folio, 3 people who were with me. Camille, I would never. Marcus is my business partner. I've never had so much as a drink alone with him that wasn't in a room full of other people from the firm, because I've watched what happens to women in this industry when people start whispering things like this. I wanted to believe she was lying. It would have been easier than what happened next, which was Priscilla, shaken, clearly trying to understand why she was being accused of something she hadn't done, saying something that reoriented the entire investigation. Camille, listen to me. Something's been off around here for months, and it's not me. There's money moving through a vendor account for one of your family's event contracts that doesn't match what we've billed. I flagged it to accounting back in June because it looked like duplicate payments, and I got told it was a family matter, to leave it alone. I hadn't thought about it since, until you said Buckhead just now, because that vendor is an event company, Whitfield & Co. I stood in that parking garage and felt the floor of everything I believed shift half an inch to the left. Denise's company, I said. I don't know anything for certain, Priscilla said quickly. I don't want to accuse anyone. I'm telling you what I saw in a spreadsheet. Before I walked away, she said one more thing, almost an afterthought, the kind of detail a person offers when still too rattled to filter herself. Whoever told you it was me, you might want to ask yourself why they were so sure. I've worked with Marcus for 6 years. Nobody who actually knows this office would land on me first. Somebody handed you my name. I told her I didn't know what she meant. I drove home telling myself she was simply deflecting, but the sentence stayed lodged in me for days the way the rest of the conversation didn't, the way a splinter stays even after you've stopped noticing the rest of your hand. I didn't tell Denise about the vendor payments Priscilla had mentioned. I don't know exactly why in the moment. Some instinct I didn't have language for yet. Some small cold thing that had started to form in the back of my mind and wasn't ready to be spoken aloud. I told her I needed a few days to think. She said she understood. She told me she loved me, that whatever happened she was in my corner, that we'd figure this out together. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my dark kitchen a long time, thinking about a woman I'd trusted completely for 6 months and a sentence she'd said back in July I hadn't thought about since. The kind of place people go when they don't want to run into anyone they know. I hadn't asked her how she knew that. Months later, across a reception hall, strung with string lights, I would watch Denise throw her head back, laughing at something one of the groomsmen said, completely at ease, completely unaware that I'd spent all that time turning over a question she'd handed me without meaning to. I would stand there with a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking, and I would think about that unanswered question one more time, right before I finally asked it out loud, in front of everyone she loved. I want to be honest, I did not wake up the next morning certain Denise was sleeping with my husband. That is not how the truth arrives for a woman who has spent 6 months building an entire emotional life around trusting someone. The truth arrives in pieces, and each piece has to fight through everything you already believe before you're willing to look at it directly. What I had after that night was not a conviction. It was a discomfort. A small, specific discomfort about a woman who knew a hotel's reputation for discretion a little too precisely for someone who'd only ever booked event blocks there. So I did what I'd been doing since March. I watched, but now I watch differently. I stopped watching Marcus for evidence of Priscilla and started watching Denise. The first thing I noticed, once I was really looking, was how much Denise already knew before I told her things. In late October, I mentioned, almost as a throwaway comment, that Marcus had a work trip to Nashville coming. 2 days later, on a call about something else entirely, she asked out of nowhere whether I'd decided if I was going with him to Nashville for the Hendrix thing. I hadn't mentioned Hendrix to her. I only knew about it because I'd seen the name on a folder on Marcus's desk that he hadn't discussed with me at all. When I asked how she knew, she said easily, "Marcus mentioned it at Sunday dinner a few weeks back. Don't you remember? You were in the kitchen." I did not remember, because it hadn't happened. I'd been at that dinner the whole time, and Marcus hadn't mentioned any deal by name. I didn't confront her. This is the part people find most surprising when I tell this story. I said nothing. I filed it away, the way I'd filed away the phone and the hotel charge, months earlier, before I understood what I was looking at. I'd learned by then that saying something out loud to the wrong person too early meant losing the only advantage I had. Everyone still believed I didn't know anything. So I started testing. The first test was almost nothing, a throwaway line to see if it traveled. I told Denise, half laughing, that I'd found a receipt for a bracelet on Marcus's card that October, a piece of jewelry I'd never received, and that I didn't know what to make of it. There was no bracelet. I'd invented the whole thing on the spot, the kind of detail with just enough weight to be worth passing along, and just little enough that no one would think twice about where it came from. 3 days later, at a family dinner, my niece mentioned, entirely innocently, how much she loved the new bracelet Aunt Denise had gotten for her birthday. A gift from Marcus, she said, the kind of thing only a brother that thoughtful would think to pick out. I sat at that table and felt something in my chest go very still. Either Denise had built a real bracelet out of a fake detail within 72 hours, coordinating a cover story with Marcus fast enough that it had already reached her own daughter, or the bracelet had existed before I ever mentioned it, and my invented detail had collided, by pure chance, with a truth I didn't yet know I'd stumbled into. Both possibilities pointed the same direction. Neither one was comfortable to sit with. It could have meant nothing. Coincidences happen, even convenient ones, but it told me something useful. Whatever I gave Denise reached Marcus, reliably, fast, even when it had no reason to. The second test was more deliberate. I told her, in early November, that I was thinking about hiring a private investigator now that the Priscilla lead had gone cold, that I felt we needed someone with real resources who could pull hotel records and financials the way 2 amateurs couldn't. Her reaction was immediate, and for the first time since June, slightly too fast. "I really don't think that's necessary yet," she said. "Investigators leave paper trails too, Camille. If Marcus finds out you hired someone, he'll know you're onto him and he'll get more careful. We're so close. Give me another few weeks." Give me another few weeks. Not give it another few weeks. Give me... The third test was the one I'd been building toward without fully admitting it to myself. I told Denise, during a call about nothing in particular, that I'd decided to take a solo trip to Savannah the following weekend. Just to clear my head, I said, get out of the house, not tell Marcus exactly where I was. It was a lie. I had no intention of going anywhere. I wanted to see whether that piece of information, my own whereabouts, deliberately hidden from my husband, would find its way back to him. It did. On the Thursday before my invented trip, Marcus asked, with a carefulness I noticed even at the time, whether I had big plans for the weekend and whether I'd be around. I told him no plans at all and watched something in his face relax in a way that told me he'd been braced for a different answer. Denise had told him, not the family, not a mutual friend. Denise, whom I'd specifically asked not to mention it to him, had relayed my private plans to my husband within 48 hours. When I asked her, gently, without accusation, she said she must have mentioned it, in passing, and hadn't realized it was meant to be a secret from him specifically. Plausible. Also, the third piece of evidence in 3 months that whatever loyalty Denise had pledged to me did not survive contact with a phone call from her brother. The fourth test, the one I ran in late November, was the one that finally moved this from suspicion to something closer to certainty in my own mind, even though I still had nothing I could put in front of a lawyer. We were at Marcus's mother's house for a birthday dinner. Reaching for the salt, Marcus referred to a restaurant, a small Italian place 2 towns over, by a nickname, the Garden Spot, he called it. The way you'd refer to somewhere so familiar you'd stopped using its real name. I had never heard of it. Denise, across the table, laughed and said, "Oh, I love that place," before catching herself half a second too late and adding, "I mean, from what you've told me about it." Marcus hadn't told her anything about it, not at that dinner, not that whole evening. She'd recognized a restaurant from a nickname alone, instantly, the specific fluency of someone who had eaten there many times, and then tried, clumsily, to explain that fluency as secondhand. It was such a small thing. A restaurant nickname, half a sentence, corrected almost before it left her mouth. If I hadn't already been watching that closely, I would never have caught it, and I think that's the part of this story worth understanding. The people who get away with this for years are rarely careless. Denise made exactly one unguarded slip in all those months, in front of exactly one person paying close enough attention to notice, and even then, she nearly recovered it cleanly enough that I might have let it go. By December, I had a hypothesis. I did not have proof. And I want to be honest, there was a full week that month where I doubted myself so completely I called Denise crying, apologizing for having grown distant, terrified I'd built an entire secret suspicion against the one person who'd shown up for me, out of nothing but grief, and the specific derangement of a woman whose marriage was falling apart in slow motion. She comforted me the way she'd been comforting me since that first phone call in June. She told me I wasn't losing my mind. She told me she'd never leave my side through this. She told me a sentence I'd remember later, for reasons she couldn't have anticipated. "I know exactly what you're going through, Camille. Better than you think." I thanked her. I told her I loved her. Then I hung up and started building my case again, more carefully this time. The woman helping me find the truth had been managing, from the very beginning, exactly how much of it I was allowed to see. 6 months from that phone call, Denise would find me near the bar at my niece's wedding, her hand closing around my arm the way it always did, still fully convinced she was managing me. She had no idea how close December had come to breaking that particular illusion for good, or how much closer January was about to bring it. The proof, when it finally arrived that January, did not come from a hotel record or a credit card statement. It came from an $11 catering line item. I was helping my daughter finalize vendors for her own engagement party, and Denise, insistent, as always, on handling the family's events herself, sent over a spreadsheet from Whitfield & Co. to compare pricing. Buried in a tab labeled 2025 Corporate Retainer Notes, clearly not meant for my eyes, was a line, "Private Dinner, M.W., Bellhaven Private Room, recurring monthly since March. Booked, invoiced, and paid quietly through a corporate account tied to Marcus's firm, under an internal code that matched no client event I recognized." March. The same month the phone had started disappearing off the kitchen island. I sat with that spreadsheet open on my laptop nearly an hour before I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't the affair happening despite Denise. This was Denise's own company, quietly billing, coordinating, and concealing it, providing the private rooms, the discretion, the corporate event cover, month after month, for almost a year. I called the direct line for Belhaven's private events coordinator and told a small, careful lie about needing to confirm a reservation detail for an upcoming Whitfield & Co. booking. The coordinator, helpful and entirely unaware of what she was confirming, told me the MW dinner was a standing monthly reservation, always the same private room, always arranged personally by Denise Whitfield, always attended by Mr. Whitfield and a guest, never listed by name, per Ms. Whitfield's instructions, for privacy. Per Ms. Whitfield's instructions. There was a second tab in that same spreadsheet, one I almost skipped past because it looked like nothing. A personal expense log Denise kept for her own tax purposes, mixed in with the corporate billing by accident. A jewelry purchase dated 3 days after the dinner where I'd invented a bracelet out of thin air from a boutique downtown, paid on Denise's own card, description field left blank. 3 days. Not before. After. I hadn't caught her repeating a lie. I'd caught her building one, in real time, off a detail I'd handed her myself. I sat in my car outside Belhaven a long time that afternoon, not going in, just sitting with the specific, physical sensation of a year-long friendship rearranging itself into something else entirely. Every phone call, every dinner, every night she'd held my hand across my own kitchen table, telling me I deserved better than my husband. All of it had happened while she personally arranged the exact rooms where he was betraying me. But I want to tell you about the second thing I found that day, because it's the part of this story that changed how I understood everything. And it did not make Denise look worse. It made the whole situation more complicated than a simple affair. Buried in the same spreadsheet, a note dated the previous September read, MW, asked again about D, told him no, not discussing arrangement details was/C, reminded him this was never supposed to be permanent. Not supposed to be permanent. It took 2 more weeks, and one more careful, painful conversation, this one with Marcus's assistant Yolanda, a woman I'd known 15 years who wept before she told me anything, to understand what that note actually meant. The affair had not started that March. It had started nearly 3 years earlier, in the wreckage of Denise's divorce from Curtis, during a stretch when Marcus, by Yolanda's account, had been helping his sister get back on her feet, driving her to appointments, co-signing a business loan for Whitfield & Co., when no bank would touch her on her own credit, spending long evenings at her apartment while she cried about the marriage that had just ended. It had begun, as these things sometimes horrifyingly do, as comfort between 2 people who'd known each other their whole lives, and it had never fully ended. There'd been a stretch, roughly a year, when they'd stopped. Yolanda believed this part, though she couldn't be certain. A stretch when Denise had tried to build something real with a man named Terrence I vaguely remembered from a barbecue, and Marcus had, by Yolanda's account, been a wreck that entire year in ways I'd misread, at the time, as stress from work. It had started again the previous spring, the same spring Denise had first called me, worried about the changes she'd noticed in me. She had not called because she'd noticed something was wrong. She had called because she already knew exactly what was wrong, because she was the reason, and she had decided. I believe this now, and I believed it standing in my own kitchen with Yolanda's words still ringing in my ears, that the safest place for her to be was not hiding from me, but standing directly beside me, holding my hand through an investigation she could quietly steer for as long as she needed to. There was one more piece I found in those weeks, the one I've gone back and forth about, including more than any other, because it doesn't make anyone look better and doesn't resolve into a tidy lesson. Cross-referencing old calendars against the Belhaven invoice, I found a night 3 Septembers earlier, the same September Yolanda had described, that I remembered with painful clarity for an entirely different reason. It was the night of my father's memorial dinner. Marcus had left early that night, telling the family a work emergency, and I'd assumed, in my grief, he simply couldn't sit with all of us in that much sadness. I found out 3 years later, reading a calendar entry that matched a Belhaven reservation to the hour, that he'd left my father's memorial to be with his sister. I never asked either of them whether that was the first night or simply one more in a pattern already begun. By the time I found that entry, the specific chronology no longer mattered as much as I once thought it would. What mattered was understanding the shape of what I was dealing with. Not a single mistake, not a moment of weakness on a business trip, but a second, parallel relationship that had run quietly alongside my real marriage for nearly 3 years, tended by two people who had spent all of that time deciding, together, how much of it I was allowed to know. Marcus did not know that I knew any of this. Denise did not know either. And here is the detail that unsettles me most, even now. I don't believe Marcus fully understood what Denise was doing to manage me. I believe he thought his sister was protecting their secret purely out of loyalty and self-preservation. I don't think he ever knew she was the one who'd handed me Priscilla's name, spending 3 months of my life on a woman who'd done nothing wrong, purely to buy herself time. In his own limited, cowardly way, Marcus believed he was managing one betrayal. He never understood his sister was running a second one, right alongside it, aimed at both of us. I sat with all of that for 3 weeks before I decided anything. I did not confront Denise. I did not confront Marcus. I called a divorce attorney quietly, using a name that wasn't mine for the initial consultation, and began, carefully and without a single visible change in my behavior, moving what could be moved. Accounts, documents, the ownership structure of my studio, which had always, thankfully, been entirely mine. I decided the truth would not come out in my kitchen, or a lawyer's office, or a screaming match in my own driveway. It would come out somewhere Denise couldn't control the room. Somewhere she'd spent her entire career learning how to manage. An event with a guest list, a schedule, and 100 witnesses. Except this time, she wouldn't be the one running it. My niece's wedding was set for the second Saturday in June, 5 months out. Denise, of course, was planning it. I told her I couldn't wait. 5 months is a long time to sit on the truth. I want to walk you through what those months actually looked like, because it wasn't a quiet countdown. It was one of the hardest performances of my life. I still had dinner with Marcus most nights. I still went to family functions. I still took Denise's calls. Still let her hold my hand at my kitchen table. Still let her tell me, with what I now understood was a specific, practiced tenderness, that I deserved better than the man she was sleeping with. There were nights that winter when I genuinely didn't know whether I could keep doing it, when the sheer effort of sitting across from someone and mirroring 8 months of trust I no longer felt left me hollowed out by 10 p.m. But something had shifted in me, and I want to name it precisely, because I think it's the actual engine of everything that happened at that wedding. I stopped being a woman waiting to find out the truth and became a woman who already knew it and was now studying two people who didn't know she knew. That reversal changes everything about how you move through a room. You stop flinching. You start watching for what people do when they think no one's keeping score. In February, I ran one more test, the last one, and the most deliberate. I told Denise, over coffee, that I'd finally decided to hire a forensic accountant to go through Marcus's business accounts, to see if there's a pattern to the spending, something a normal person like me would miss. It was true, actually. I had hired one, quietly, the month before, though not for the reason I gave her. I wanted to see whether that specific piece of information, accountant, business accounts, pattern of spending, would produce a different reaction than the earlier private investigator conversation had. It did. Denise went very still for a moment, then said, carefully, that she thought it was a smart move, honestly, long overdue, and asked, almost too casually, whether the accountant would be looking at the whole business or just certain vendors. It was the first time in 8 months she'd asked me a direct, specific question about the shape of an investigation instead of steering the shape of it herself. I understood, watching her ask it, that I had finally found the edge of what she could control. She was no longer managing my suspicion. She was trying to find out how much I already knew. I told her the accountant was starting broad, just getting a baseline, and watched relief move across her face before she could stop it. I never hired a forensic accountant to look at Marcus's firm at all. I'd already found everything I needed in a spreadsheet she'd sent me by accident. There was a dinner in March, 3 months before the wedding, that I still think about more than almost any other night that year. Marcus had cooked, something he only ever did when he wanted to smooth something over without naming what it was. And halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and said, out of nowhere, "I feel like I've lost you a little bit this year, even when you're here." It was, I think, the single most honest sentence he said to me in that entire final stretch. In all the time I now knew he'd been lying to me. And the terrible, complicated truth is that I believed him completely. Because it was true. I had lost interest in him, in a way he could feel and not explain. Because some deeper part of me had already left the marriage months before my mind caught up with the decision. I told him I'd just been tired, work had been a lot, and watched him accept that answer with visible relief, the same relief I'd learned to recognize in Denise months earlier, the relief of someone bracing for an ending that didn't come. I went to bed that night and lay awake a long time, turning over the strange fact that the man lying to me had just told me, without meaning to, the truest thing anyone had said in that entire year. By April, 2 months before the wedding, Marcus started acting strange in a way that had nothing to do with Priscilla, or hotels, or late nights. He grew quieter at dinner. He started asking me, more than once, whether I was doing okay, in a tone that suggested he suspected something was different about me without being able to name what. I wondered, more than once, whether Denise had told him about the accountant question, whether the two of them were having their own version of the conversation I was having with myself, trying to read a woman who had gotten frighteningly good at not being read. I found out later that I was right to wonder. In May, a month before the wedding, I learned, from Yolanda again, in a second conversation I'd initiated carefully, over lunch, framed as simply wanting to understand Marcus better before I decided anything, that Marcus had asked Denise, directly, whether she thought I knew something. Denise had told him no. She told him I was still grieving, still confused, still chasing shadows around Priscilla. She told her own brother, a month before the wedding, that she had it handled. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the detail that finally answered the question I'd been circling for months. What did Denise actually want out of all this? Not simply Marcus. She could have had an affair with her brother's blessing kept private, without volunteering, unprompted, to walk his wife through a year-long investigation of it. What she wanted was control of the outcome, to be the one who decided when, whether, and how the truth ever reached me, so that no matter what happened between her and Marcus, she would never be the one blindsided, never be the one caught by surprise the way she'd spent her whole childhood watching her mother get caught by surprise. She had built herself into the single most trusted source of information in my life specifically so that the truth could never arrive except through her hands, on her timeline, shaped exactly the way she needed it shaped. She had no idea I'd stopped needing her hands months earlier. The reception was held in a restored carriage house outside Atlanta, the kind of venue Denise specialized in. String lights strung across exposed beams, a band that could move from soul to Motown to slow jazz without breaking stride, round tables dressed in ivory linen. She'd built the whole evening herself, down to the seating chart, which had placed Marcus and me at the head table, 6 feet from the sweetheart table, with Denise 2 seats down, close enough to watch us both. I'd spent the drive over rehearsing nothing at all. I'd decided, somewhere in the final month, that the version of tonight that would actually work couldn't be scripted, because Denise had spent a year reading me carefully enough to catch a rehearsed line the moment it left my mouth. What I needed instead was patience, the same patience I'd used for a year to watch her, and one true piece of information, delivered at the right moment, to a room that was already listening. I danced with my husband once, early in the evening, because it would have looked strange not to, and because some old, stubborn part of me wanted one more dance with the man I'd loved for over 2 decades before I ended what was left of him. He held me the way he always had, And for a moment, I let myself feel the full, complicated grief of loving someone who had also been quietly destroying you, its own particular kind of heartbreak nobody warns you about. "You seem different tonight," he said, close to my ear. "I feel different," I told him, and it was the truest thing I'd said to him in a year. Denise found me not long after, her hand on my arm, her voice warm, her eyes doing that small automatic scan of the room she'd been doing for months without realizing I'd noticed. I told her she'd been a good friend to me. I meant every word, in the way that only makes sense once you understand gratitude and betrayal can occupy the exact same sentence. I waited until the toasts had finished, until the cake had been cut, until the band slowed the room for the last dance sets of the night. The moment at any wedding when people are loose enough to talk, when small groups form around tables, when a quiet sentence can travel exactly as far as you want it to, and no further. I found Denise near the bar, laughing with two of Marcus's cousins, riding the specific high of a woman whose event had gone flawlessly. I waited for a gap in the conversation, stepped in beside her, and said, in a voice pitched for her and the two cousins and no one else, the sentence I'd been building for a year in one form or another. "Denise, I finally figured out why Marcus still calls you Belle when he texts. I always thought it was some old nickname from when you two were kids. Turns out it's from Bellhaven. Isn't that funny? A whole nickname built out of a restaurant." I watched it land. I've thought about this exact moment more than almost any other in my life, so let me describe it precisely. Denise's face didn't collapse. She was too skilled for that, even at the end. What happened instead was smaller and, in its own way, worse. A half-second of total stillness, the specific stillness of someone recalculating an entire year of careful work in real time, followed by a laugh that came out one beat too late and one register too high. What are you talking about? I don't know anything about a nickname. That's strange, I said, still pleasant, still quiet, still exactly the woman she'd spent a year believing she understood completely. Because I do. I've known for a while now, actually. I just wanted to see how long you'd let it go on. One of the cousins, sensing the air had shifted the way people always sense it, right before a room breaks apart, said carefully, "Denise, what's she talking about?" Marcus arrived at the edge of that conversation, about 4 seconds too late to stop it, drawn by whatever instinct pulls a man toward the sound of his own name changing tone across a room. He looked at his sister's face first, then at mine, and I watched him understand, in the space of maybe 2 seconds, that this was not a misunderstanding he could smooth over with a joke. "Camille," he said, low, "can we talk about this somewhere else?" "We can," I said. "But I think your sister should stay for this part. She's been so involved in every other part of my life this year. Seems wrong to leave her out of the ending." I did not raise my voice. I did not name what had happened outright. Not yet. Not with everyone still able to hear. I'd learned, over the last year, exactly how much power a controlled sentence carries in a room that loves drama but fears scenes. And I used it now, the way I'd use it in any negotiation. Precisely, without wasting a single word. I looked at Denise. "You told me it was Priscilla," I said. "You handed me her name like a gift. 3 months of my life, Denise. 3 months I spent tearing apart an innocent woman's reputation because you needed somewhere for me to look that wasn't you." "Camille, I don't know what you think you found, but Bellhaven has a private dining room," I continued, still quiet, still steady, booked every month since March of last year, under a corporate code, arranged personally by you, for a private dinner for Mr. Whitfield and a guest. I have the invoice. I have the reservation confirmation. I have a very helpful woman at the front desk who told me the two of you go way back. The cousins had gone completely silent. Somewhere behind me, the band was still playing, oblivious, and I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that this was probably the most controlled moment of my entire adult life, that I was ending my marriage and exposing the deepest betrayal of it in a tone barely above conversational, in a rented carriage house, while a saxophone drifted over all of it like nothing was happening at all. Marcus's face had gone the color of old paper. "Denise," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the second syllable. Tell her it's not what it sounds like." Denise didn't tell me that. For the first time in a year, Denise said nothing at all, and the silence did more damage than any confession could have. That was the first reveal. The room understood, in that silence, that Denise Whitfield was the woman. The second reveal came a few minutes later, once Marcus's mother had been quietly pulled aside by a cousin, once the band had, mercifully, been signaled to keep playing so the reception didn't visibly collapse. Once we'd moved to a smaller room off the main hall where the wedding party had taken photos earlier that evening. Marcus tried, in that room, to make this about how long ago it had started, as though the calendar could soften what it was. Denise tried, tears fully arrived now, to explain the divorce, and the loan, and the year she'd tried with Terrence, and the specific loneliness that kept pulling her back toward the one person who had always, her whole life, made her feel like she mattered. "You don't understand what it was like," Denise said, her voice cracking, "watching Marcus build the life he built, watching you build the life you built. I lost my marriage, and my credit, and half my friends in that divorce, and he was the only person who showed up. I never meant for it to turn into this, and then once it had, I didn't know how to make it stop without losing everything. Him, you, the whole family." "You didn't lose it by accident, Denise," I said. "You managed it. For a year, you managed exactly how much of it I got to see. That's not the same thing as not knowing how to make it stop." She flinched at that, and for a moment, I watched something genuine move across her face. Not performance, not damage control, something closer to recognition. I let them both talk. I'd spent a year learning how to be quiet while people revealed themselves, and I wasn't going to stop now, in the one conversation where it mattered most. When they finished, I told them the thing I'd been waiting a year to say, and it wasn't the sentence either of them expected. "I know you think tonight is about you finding out that I found out," I said. "It's not. I found out in January. I've had 5 months to decide what I wanted to do with what I know, and I want you both to understand something before this goes any further. I didn't spend those 5 months grieving. I spent them building. My accounts are separated. My studio was always mine. I've already spoken to an attorney, and everything you two spent a year trying to hide has already been documented in more detail than either of you realizes." I looked at Denise. "There was never a bracelet, Denise. I made it up in October, over dinner, just to see where it went. 3 days later, you bought one. The Savannah trip I told you about in November, I never planned to go anywhere. I told you specifically not to mention it to him. He asked me about it 2 days later, and the forensic accountant I mentioned in February, I told you I was starting broad because I wanted to see what question you'd ask next. You asked which vendors. I let that sit for a second. Somewhere in there, you stopped managing my investigation. You started trying to find out how much of yours I'd already found." Denise's face, when I said that, did something I'll remember for the rest of my life. A specific, silent understanding arriving all at once. The understanding that she hadn't been managing me for a year. I had been testing her, methodically, the entire time, and she had answered every single question I'd handed her. "I loved you," Denise said finally, her voice raw. "That part was real, Camille. I want you to know that part was real." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it, which was somehow the cruelest thing I could have said, because it meant everything that came before hadn't been a total lie, and that hurt, in a way a total lie never could have. "I think you loved me and betrayed me at the same time, for a whole year, and never once let either feeling get in the way of the other. That's not going to be easy for either of us to live with, but it's yours to live with now, not mine." Marcus, who had been quiet through most of this, finally spoke, and what he said surprised me more than anything else that night. "She told me you didn't suspect anything," he said, looking at his sister, something breaking open in his voice that had nothing to do with me at all. "You told me you had it handled. The whole time, I thought, I thought I was the one making the decisions here, and I wasn't even the one who knew what was actually happening in my own house. He looked at me, and for the first time in a year, I saw something honest cross his face. Not an apology, not yet, but the specific, disorienting vertigo of a man realizing he had never once been in control of the thing he thought he was controlling. He had believed he was managing a secret. He had actually been managed by two women simultaneously, and the second one, he was only now understanding, had known more than either of them the entire time. Before I left, my niece found me near the coat check, still in her wedding dress, mascara smudged from crying, though not from anything I'd done. Someone had already given her a shorthand version, the way news like that moves through a family in minutes once it starts. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry this happened tonight, of all nights," and I understood she meant her wedding, and understood too that some smaller, more selfish part of her was grieving the version of the evening she'd planned for a year, now permanently rewritten. I held her face in my hands, the way I'd done since she was small, and told her the only true thing I had left in me that night. None of this is because of you, and none of it belongs to you. Go back to your husband. This is still your wedding. Let me carry the rest of it. She hugged me a long time before she let go. I left the carriage house before midnight. I didn't wait to see the aftermath. The whispered conversations, the mother of the groom's tears, the slow unraveling of a family that would take years, not one night, to fully understand what had happened at that wedding. I heard about most of it secondhand, in the weeks that followed, from people who felt they owed me an account of what I'd missed. I didn't need it. I'd already lived the version of that night that mattered. The divorce took 11 months, which is fast, as these things go, mostly because I'd spent the previous year making sure there would be very little left to argue about. Marcus didn't contest much. I think, in the end, some part of him understood that a long fight would only extend how long the story stayed alive in the mouths of people who'd once respected him. He lost more than the marriage. He lost the specific standing he'd held in his own family for 48 years, the golden version of himself that a childhood of being favored over his sister had built, brick by brick, until it became the only version of himself he knew how to be. His mother, from what I understand, has still not fully forgiven either of her children, and family gatherings that used to be effortless now require careful choreography about who attends which holiday. I'm told Marcus has started seeing someone new, a divorced woman from his gym, and that he's careful, almost frightened, in that relationship in a way he never was with me, checking in too often, explaining his whereabouts before anyone asks. I think, in his own way, he's still living with the vertigo of that night in the carriage house, the discovery that being in control and believing you're in control are not the same thing at all. Denise lost her business. Not immediately, and not because of anything I did directly. I never once spoke publicly about what happened, never posted anything, never gave the story to anyone outside the small circle of people who'd been in that room. But Atlanta's wealthy, tightly networked event world runs on trust and whispers in roughly equal measure, and a story like that one doesn't stay contained no matter how quietly the wronged woman conducts herself. Whitfield & Co. lost 3 major contracts within the year. She closed the business 18 months after the wedding and moved to Charlotte, where, I'm told, she works in event coordination for a hotel chain under a title with considerably less authority than the one she used to hold. I don't take satisfaction in that, exactly. I think about her more than I expected to, given everything. I think about the woman who called me on a Sunday afternoon and told me about her father, crying, giving me a piece of herself I still believe was genuine even now. I think about the fact that a person can hand you real comfort with one hand while quietly taking something irreplaceable with the other, and both of those things can be true about the same person in the same year, and understanding that doesn't make either one less true. Priscilla, for what it's worth, is the one relationship that came out of that year better than it went in. I called her a month after the wedding, not to apologize exactly. An apology felt too small for what I'd put her through, but to tell her the truth, all of it, so she'd understand the accusation in that parking garage had never really been about her at all. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet a moment before saying, "I figured it was something like that. I just didn't know it was her. We have lunch every few months now, two women who were both used, in different ways, by people who needed somewhere to point a finger." She left the firm 2 years ago and started her own brokerage. I sent flowers on her opening day. She sent flowers when I opened the second Renard Interiors office. Some friendships get built out of nothing. Ours got built out of an apology that took real courage to make and real grace to accept. Yolanda still works for Marcus's firm, technically, though I understand their relationship has never quite recovered its old ease, and I understand why. I never blamed her for taking 3 years to finally tell me the truth. Loyalty is a complicated thing to untangle from fear, especially for a woman 15 years into a job she needs, working for a man who signs her paycheck. I sent her a card the week the divorce was finalized, thanking her for the one conversation that cost her something to have. She never mentioned it again, and neither did I. Some debts are better honored in silence. What I gained is harder to describe in a single sentence, but I'll try. I gained the specific, hard-earned knowledge that I don't fall apart. I spent a year collecting evidence of my own betrayal with the same discipline I'd used to build a firm from nothing, and somewhere in that year, without fully noticing it happen, I stopped being a woman waiting to find out if her life was going to be taken from her, and became a woman quietly deciding what she was going to keep. Renard Interiors expanded into a second city 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I bought a house on my own for the first time in my adult life and furnished it exactly the way I wanted, which is to say, without a single piece of furniture that had ever belonged to a marriage I was building for someone else's comfort. I was asked once at an industry dinner by a younger woman who'd heard some version of the story secondhand how I'd managed to stay so calm through all of it. I told her the truth, and it's the same thing I'll tell you now, because I think it's the only piece of this whole story worth keeping. I didn't stay calm because I wasn't hurting. I stayed calm because calm was the only thing in that entire year no one could take from me. Marcus took 22 years he swore were something they weren't. Denise took a friendship I would have defended to anyone who questioned it. But neither of them ever got my composure, because I never once let them see how much I knew until I'd decided, entirely on my own terms, that it was time. I trusted Denise with the one thing I should have kept for myself, my own eyes. It took me a year to learn how to trust them again. I don't think I'll ever hand that particular kind of trust to anyone else. Not fully, not the way I handed it to her. But I've come to believe that's not a wound, it's a boundary, and I built it myself, out of the wreckage of the last person who convinced me I didn't need one. I didn't need to destroy anyone that night at the wedding. I only needed to stop protecting them from what they'd already done to themselves. Denise spent a year teaching me how to look for a liar in my own house. I don't think she ever once considered that she was also teaching me how to recognize her. That, in the end, was the only kind of justice I ever actually wanted.